Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Digital Difference. You're here with me, Scott Gulliver, and Ollie's here today as well.
Hi guys, how you doing?
And we're on episode 18 now. And today we wanted to talk all about scaling digital products and experiences. It's a topic I thought was quite relevant at the moment, as I think this year is going to be really interesting with certainly the pandemic as the constant looming background to everything we do. I think this year is going to be a real interesting one where companies have to not only invest in new avenues of digital, but also they're probably going to be scaling up to new audiences and also just scaling out their own products as well. So I think we're broadly talking scaling across the board, and I think it'd be good to cover that today. But yeah, I mean, what are your first thoughts on this subject, Ollie?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting actually that we are looking into this or that we've started this, because I saw an ad today from Huawei who immediately came out saying like we're putting in half of our workforce into R&D, and like in terms of let's talk about just as a project. In terms of a project, that's massive because they're trying to deliver something. They're trying to obviously deliver these huge products and these huge projects. So they're worth. Well, they're thinking about investing half of their workforce as a resource into this. So that in itself, if you want to talk about something as scalable, is absolutely massive within itself.
That's a huge team, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah,
that is
and
a big budget.
they've said they've got over 200,000 people
Wow.
that work for them or something like that. So
Yeah.
that can't be right. 200,000? I swear it was like 190,000 or something like that. And they said over half of that works. They're a pretty big company, but yeah, I mean, it's absolutely crazy to have that many people working just on R&D.
Yeah. But I think 2021 has come about, and we're seeing this a lot, aren't we? Where it seems like a lot of projects were on hold last year, and there was a bit of uncertainty around the landscape. We're obviously still in that space, but now that we've seen probably another close to 6-12 months of it coming up, companies are really having to kind of throw in the chips a little bit and start gambling on not gambling, but start putting the money where the mouth was, and where the mouth is in terms of actually building new things. But I think we spend so much of our conversation and so much of the landscape and the noise out there is about kind of digital transformation and starting that journey. But I think there's a really interesting point that comes when you go from having started to dive into products and technology, and actually you go to the next step of actually either properly, like you say, putting budget into something, or properly investing into that area and just really scaling that side of things up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that this is where this year, like you've just said, Scott, this is where we're going to see these massive scalable projects. So we're going to see either end. I think we're going to see like these huge projects, and we're going to see these small projects. And I think it's going to be very, very selective. We're talking about scaling up, and like, yeah, it's going to be amazing for digital and stuff, but a lot of stuff's also going to be scaled down because it's not going to be seen as relevant. And, I think every company at the moment is having probably resource issues and budget issues, and they're all up against the wire in terms of bringing in revenue. And you can tell that every board of every company is scared in terms of where the money's coming from.
Yeah.
And especially with COVID rolling in again to this year, and it probably won't be over this year. We always come back to COVID, and it's so important though at the moment on the economy. But I think that it's also going to really affect how many digital projects are scaled up and scaled down. So it will be the types of projects. I mean, Scott, what sort of projects do you think are going to be sort of scaled up, and what sort of projects do you think are going to be put on the back burner?
I think by necessity, a lot of those companies that have had a small online presence are probably going to be scaling up to new audiences. I think equally, where there's been real kind of advances in the technology for certain sectors, I can't think of any off the top of my head, but if there's been some sort of kind of niche online service to date, I would expect that their audience has probably grown dramatically as people look to online services over the past year. In terms of projects going on the back burner, I mean, it's unfortunate, but I don't think many companies are probably spending the time in much kind of R&D at the moment. Unfortunately, I think a lot of those projects have probably fallen by the wayside, and those more speculative pieces. which is unfortunate. And again, it can only hold for so long before you need to start spending money on that and think about not just this year, but the years to come as well. So yeah, it's interesting. There seems to be a wide range of projects, and certainly for what we're seeing as well, there's a lot of learning projects as well. Again, as the education sector kind of moves in that direction, and certainly obviously retail and those big kind of themes are all moving online.
Yeah, interesting that you bring up education actually, because I think that's the one thing that I've seen that's ramped up massively, especially in terms of investment from a lot of companies, is the education. Because I think people, big companies and big corporations are seeing this as the ideal time to probably upskill
Yeah.
and get their learning up together and get their people trained in the right way, because obviously everybody's stuck at home at the moment. Uh, a lot of these product projects and these sort of digital transformation projects that we're seeing, a lot of the time they're all getting scaled down because there's no, all pushed back because they don't want to deliver in a year where it's not going to make any money. So what can you invest in at the time where you can invest in your people? How do you do that? Education. And I think that that's why we're seeing such a massive boost, especially within the education industry, um, for like these different products that are coming in, and huge. Yeah, and in terms of that, that's what's really scalable at the moment. It's really interesting. It's interesting how COVID's had such an impact on just these projects and these products, and like and the actual scalability of these things. Like, obviously I think that there's going to be certain projects that are always going to stay big, and there's going to be certain projects that are always going to stay small, but depending on the delivery date. And then it also depends, like, how can they deliver it as well? So can they break these massive projects into smaller scaled mini projects, if you will, that were like slow releases? But yeah, no, I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, like that approach and how you approach a project that is really dramatically scaling, I think is an interesting one. I think broadly, taking a step back and thinking about the things that you want to consider when you're scaling up, whether that be to a drastically bigger audience, or whether you're thinking of taking a small idea that's been tested and scaling it up with much more features or to a bigger platform. I think there's broadly four themes. So you've got the technical aspects to think about. You've got some UX considerations, I think, and that's a really interesting one to talk about. You've also got the people and the teams and the support that are behind it, and then the approach is the other one. I think approach might be a good place for us to start thinking about how and what you need to think about. I mean, you said about kind of small rollouts. What are your thoughts about how best to manage a big, say you had a big audience in mind? What are the options that people have to think about?
That's a hard question.
It's like an interview.
Yeah, I know. I'm trying to just think what you've just said.
You could talk,
Yeah, rephrase that a sec.
so with the approach that you can, let me start again. So when you're when you're thinking about breaking a product out into a much bigger audience, Ollie, what are some of the approaches that you've seen people take in terms of rolling it out a little bit more slowly, or how many ways are there to handle that sort of process?
Yeah, so absolutely. I work within the financial industry. So at the moment, what we're seeing is mortgages are obviously not being bought as much because people aren't buying houses. So the issue that the company has is, do you lower your interest rates enough that people start wanting to get the mortgage because they see it's a great deal, but the company starts losing business? Or do you keep your mortgage rates near the same or lower them slightly to reflect the economy, but not too much so you're not going to lose too much business? And I think, and it's all about then the market share. And I think the issue is at the moment is that companies have to weigh up, do they want to lose money and keep market share, or do they want to sort of retain that money, lose a bit of market share, but at the same time, they might be able to keep a hold of a general customer base and audience. So for me, I think that from what I've seen personally, companies are taking second approach and kind of just holding out.
Mhm.
So they're not giving away their products too much. I mean, I haven't seen very many deals. If we look at things like Black Friday, for instance, as well, like it wasn't actually a great Black Friday in terms of deals and stuff. And I think it's because companies are under a lot of pressure to not lose money at the moment. So I think it's just everyone, in terms of a scalable project, everyone's kind of like keeping it big scale, like big scale projects, but just keeping on hold and pushing them back until next year, until COVID eventually starts lifting, and the pressure of COVID starts lifting off the economy, and then people can start actually delivering again, and going back to normal.
Yeah. Yeah, pricing is always going to be interesting when you start to scale and reach new audiences, aren't they? Because I think, especially with digital products, they're so hard to price, even at their normal standard baseline, because there's such a variety of pricing models and structures out there, and subscription models and everything else. And how you start to change that when you're thinking about reaching new people. I mean, the economy of scale would almost say that you might end up raising prices traditionally just because it would be more in demand. But then equally with a software, apart from the more technical aspects of things like server space and those sorts of bit, there's not much you're losing by adding more people. So yeah, scale does come with some interesting questions around the whole proposition, I guess, as well as anything else.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned digital though, because obviously I mentioned retail. From a retail perspective, yeah, it's getting hit hard, but maybe actually digital is one where you know they don't have they're thinking about their audience. In fact, their audience is probably increasing.
Hmm.
So those sort of that sort of audience, and supplying that sort of audience is probably actually increasing. So like the demand's increasing, so the supply has to increase. So these online digital companies are actually making more money. But unfortunately, the retail space is losing money. Financial industries are probably losing money, and this is where it's probably amazing right now to be a digital business.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of opportunity, I think. And the other thing that you can also think about when you're going for such a big increase in scale is something like more traditional kind of beta releases that we have. We see them a lot in software channels at the moment, and they're quite an opt-in. So you might get some of your audience that are a bit more tech savvy or want to kind of test out new features, even if they're a little bit unstable. But that could be a great way just to deliver to a small bunch of users initially, and still get that small test group, whilst not impacting your entire audience. And I think that's much more important as you start to think about bigger audiences for your applications. It's much more important that you get them right on the first release. So actually having a small trusted pool of users that you can kind of roll out to is useful. And then of course on the back of that, you see companies like Google, who obviously have massive audiences and huge scale. They still have rollout plans for everyone else. So not everyone really has the same features or even the same products at the same time. And again, you get this with a lot of global markets where, for example, the US gets a lot of products first, just because it's much easier for them to get feedback and tweak things and get things right for that one smaller audience, rather than a big bang kind of release to a global scale. So those types of plans, although those are on the more global scale, they can still apply, I think, to more regional audiences, or even just smaller sizes of audience as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then, so thinking about the more technical aspects, and this is probably more aligned with my background, Ollie, but you've I'm sure you've seen some of this as well. Um, this is one area I think that developers think a lot about, and certainly people that are building any type of product or experience think a lot about, is how it's going to scale over time. Um, and now that we're reliant on things like cloud architecture and moving everything to the cloud, things are much more scalable now, which is great. And actually, a lot of the time, you can build applications in a way that do just naturally scale. So they will scale down and be generally cheaper to run when there's less users using them. And then you won't get that kind of server overload that you used to get quite a lot of the time, because the servers will just keep increasing size to scale with the demand as you need it. And these are obviously great new tools that we've got in place now, just to be able to take some of that pressure off. Because I mean, in the olden days, IT teams would used to have to manage a lot of this ahead of time, and it's really hard to figure out when people are going to be using things at the same time, even if you're going to be releasing to a whole bunch of new people, for example. You might only get spikes at certain times. For example, when something's on TV, there might suddenly be a huge spike in your website traffic, and kind of predicting those can be pretty hard at times.
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen it with learning, actually, in learning delivery. The initial and how you scale there. So the initial delivery, say to a business-wide audience, is going to be massive, because that's when you're going to be at your highest point of interactive users. However, 2-3 weeks down the line, that's going to scale right down. So it's about planning. And again, you talk about server space here, Scott. It's about planning how much information is going to be used by these servers, how many users are going to be using these servers at certain times. So it's then planning around what gets priority and what pieces of content gets priority within that. So it's literally scaling up and down during time frames, and project releases as well. So and also the size of the audience that it's going out to is always key within that. So we look at, you may be able to run 2 pieces of content side by side simultaneously. Servers will be fine, because one might be really small and one might be really big. But however, if you try and release all of them at the same time, huge scale project, you're going to shut down these servers, and
Yeah.
you're going to end up with a system crash. So I think it's all about your timing and managing the priorities of each piece of content. I think that's what the project management behind these as well. That's where it's key, really.
It's tough to predict, though, isn't it? I mean, even if you know you're going to be releasing, it is tough to predict what that audience is going to be. And I think this is especially relevant for companies who might have tested the water with like an MVP or minimum viable product type thing, where they're just releasing to a small audience or just have a small proof of concept that's out there. When you suddenly switch it over to the full audience, even if you've got a rough idea of numbers, it can be really difficult to know what that traffic is going to be. And as I say, this is where cloud infrastructure takes a lot of that headache away. But of course, you are then throwing cost at the problem. Basically, you're throwing your money. But hopefully, if you manage that right, there is also the savings you get from not having the full level of server space. Because as you say, you get spikes, and then all of a sudden, a day later, it's back down to 1 or 2 people accessing it every now and again. And you
I do think cloud infrastructure is the future, though. I
Mm.
know it's expensive now, but I think that it's not going to be in a few years' time, because it's going to be the standard business practice that everybody's going to use. And again, like, it's probably going to take away from that issue that we've just been talking about, with the servers overloading and stuff like that. With everybody just working directly from the cloud, everything works perfectly, and you don't have that local network issue, if you will, that you'll probably be seeing all the time. And loads of businesses have it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's like the one major problem probably of every IT department, really, with every business is overloading servers and servers crashing all the time. So having that cloud-based solution is probably the best thing. But to do that, I think you also have to have a great network, a great local network, not just local network, a great network within your area as well. Otherwise, it doesn't always work so well. If you think about cloud infrastructure, working in a third world country, for instance, where their local network isn't that great, the area network isn't that great, then you're probably going to have more issues than somewhere like the UK, where we've got an amazing network.
Yeah, and this is where that you can get the kind of core experience right for most users. But actually, another aspect to think about as you start scaling up is, with a more broad audience, there are going to be those on weaker networks and fancy devices and everything else, and being able to cater with all of those technically is suddenly much more of a consideration. And just going back to cloud for a second before we move on to the UX, I think another good reason to use that is to use cloud infrastructure is the security aspect. And again, as you start scaling up and more people start using the system, security becomes much more a pressing concern. It's hugely important anyway, and should be at the forefront. But certainly, cloud software again, or cloud servers again, make that much easier to have as kind of a turnkey solution. And ultimately, Google, Amazon servers are inherently much more secure than pretty much any other IT department, right? So there's a very good reason to start using those platforms as a kind of base and a backbone for almost everything you do, and then hopefully scale becomes a natural kind of just turn on thing, which is great.
Yeah.
So think about UX, and this is an interesting one because I started exploring this before the podcast, and didn't really think there would be much in it. But actually, I think there are quite a few things to think about when you're scaling up. Again, to start off, obviously a broader audience, and you'll get some considerations there, like whether they've got a weaker network or underpowered devices, and certainly thinking about those much more prominently is, I think, a good place to start.
I think that when we build a product or we look at any sort of digital project, we have to think about accessibility
Yeah,
behind the UX. So obviously the user experience is really important to any digital project or any digital product that we're going to build. So you need to make the accessibility scalable within that. So when you're rolling out to us, maybe a smaller audience, you don't need to really think too much into the detail of the accessibility, because you got to kind of know who your audience is. So you can build around those features. But as maybe that product gets bigger, or as more features are added, and the scales, and it goes to a wider scale, and it goes out to it gets built to a much larger scale, then you need to start thinking about different accessibility and how you can apply that accessibility to these products.
yeah. Accessibility, like you said, it's one of those things that does. I mean, ultimately, if you get the accessibility right, the experience improves for all of your audience. But you're absolutely right that there's less chance of it there being a critical use problem with a smaller audience, and I think that chance obviously just increases as your audience gets bigger. But yeah, I mean, starting with accessibility as well, it does the job of fixing a lot of those scaling problems when you're talking to a broader audience. So having things that are just easier for people to understand, easier to use. And again, in terms of using things, there might be other ways that you approach people using things that work better across different networks or use cases and situations. So I think you're right. That's a great way just to actually address something that's quite important anyway, but also then to have it scale much more easily as well in the future.
Absolutely, and it's key. And like you just said, it's key just to keep things simple, and
Yeah,
that makes it easier to scale. If you think about anything that you build, if you keep it simple, then it's always going to be easier to build and
yeah,
easier to develop and it's easy for it to grow. If you have a product or a project that's way too detailed, almost too unique in the beginning, trying to scale up something that's just too much into the detail just does not, it's not as easy, and it won't always work. And you'll always find that, like you've just said, you'll always come into these issues later on, that will take way more time because you've put far too much effort and detail into the beginning stage, at a much smaller scale. So it's all about understanding when to apply a certain amount of detail as you scale up, or how to take away some amount of detail as you scale down.
yeah, absolutely. I think the other thing as well is we talked about some of the technical considerations and how things like servers and network and everything else can suddenly become a bit of a bottleneck to access some of the resources. We've all seen, huge services get overloaded, and I think we're going to have that for a while. And in terms of the UX and design, I think actually just preempting some of that is actually a really useful thing to do. Especially when you start thinking about systems that are bigger than just a simple bit of software, thinking about or preemptively kind of thinking about how you're going to put error messages in front of people, or gracefully deal with errors and just expect them around every corner, is a really useful thing to do in this day and age, especially given that our technology is so complicated these days. And just to even access a website is a hugely complicated technical process. We should be expecting problems, I think, at all times. And especially when you're reaching a new audience, we're in quite a luxury in a lot of the places in the world now where we have 5G and other things that give us a great sort of infrastructure to use. But again, not everyone's going to have that, and just thinking about gracefully how you handle those can be a really great thing to do to enhance the user experience.
just kind of going on to into going back to technical companies again.
Mhm.
Do you think that these scalable tech companies need to think about certain aspects of what they're doing within tech when they're scaling?
Yeah, I think there does seem to be a lot of high profile cases, don't there, where people, well, it doesn't seem like it's been thought through. Um, and obviously, the problem we have these days is that social media is so prevalent, and people hold technology companies at such high regard that I think it doesn't take a lot to undo a lot of good reputation. Um, Cyberpunk is a great example actually of obviously that was a hugely hyped game, and that had a huge problem of I mean scale in different ways. Really, that was a almost technological scaling problem. But again, it shows at what level a project can kind of come crashing down just based on the reaction of people. So I think it's definitely worth thinking about, and I think it's also worth thinking about how well positioned your company is to be able to actually perform the level of scale that you're thinking about. Because it may just be that, especially again, coming back to the technical concerns, um, it may just be that you're not in a place at the moment where you don't have the architecture or the support in place to be able to scale up to the level that you want, and mitigating that with a better approach and a smaller rollout might actually be the way to go. Slowly build up, or build more of a roadmap over several years, instead of just going for one big approach just because that's what everyone else is doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I
Yeah.
think that, we're also seeing, if we go back to an example, we're kind of seeing, design systems and design languages being
Mhm.
a growing practice, if you think, for scaling tech companies at the moment.
Yeah.
And if you think about more and more of these companies are kind of adopting that, and adopting those sort of concepts, if you will, to develop like different standards and patterns. And I think that that's something that we're seeing massively is this sort of design language within these sort of scaling tech companies coming in, and just to make it easier for their customers and easier for their customer base.
It's really exciting to see where the industry is at the moment. I think actually it's in a pretty mature place where, like you say, that even when we approach things like MVPs and proof of concepts, and that's going to be such an important thing for a long time in tech, where there's new tech around the corner and people need to test the waters in new innovative ways of doing things. But like you say, we're in a pretty mature place across the board with design and engineering and infrastructure and everything in between, where we do think about scale quite actively. Sometimes I think the rest of the business takes a while to catch up, but like you say, things like design systems and putting them into place first of all, and thinking about how your customers are going to think about things in the future, even, it's really exciting to see all of that start to come to the forefront.
Absolutely.
So, as the kind of last theme that I think is probably worth considering, and this is one that's often missed, I think, is kind of the internal teams and the internal company. One of the more obvious parts of this, I think, is how you are able to deal with feedback and support, because it is still a very manual process and still quite a labor intensive process of providing software support, or even support on any service or product, to be perfectly honest. But people are very quick to throw in things like a chat system, for example, into their products and experiences. But those types of systems, and even email feedback, they all need people on the other end to answer calls. And if you're scaling, which is very easy to do in tech, where you just turn up a release and release to more people, you need to make sure that you're going to be able to retain the levels of customer service that you need to, or that your customers expect.
I think this is something that we've seen massive amounts on, and this is probably where chatbots are coming in handy at the moment as well. That
Yeah.
sort of virtual AI can pick up that slack, because you can. This is where I think this is a prime example, Scott, of where you can actually see a company scale down in terms of support, like within internal teams, but still keep that support to their audience.
Yeah.
um, and this is where tech is being able to actually deliver that. So we talked about chatbots before, and it's really interesting actually. But chatbots can actually can now do so much more. Can do what a whole team of 20 people could do. One chatbot can do that with a good piece of AI. Again, we can talk about it. It's at scale. So do you want to have it depends how good this chatbot can be, how much pressure it's going to be on the server. If this chatbot's dealing with all customer queries, how big is your audience base? So, there's certain elements you have to think about within the scale of this, but we probably are seeing a lot of the time now, and I know that I am, that when I'm trying to contact a company or trying to talk about a digital product to someone that I've bought, and I'm being directed into the online messaging service. So obviously these sort of these virtual chatbots are being used more than Teams, because these companies are having to kind of push back, not push back, but cut down and cut back on certain staff and internal resource. So I think that this is where we're probably seeing quite a bit of an issue with internal teams being scaled down. And unfortunately it's affecting the job world, but it's not affecting companies. The companies can scale down but keep the same level of service to the client base.
Yeah, I mean, certainly over time, I think that's the case. I think there's still probably a need when you first start scaling up to still have the people there. I think what chatbots are great at, and certainly as AI, continues to develop at pace, we're going to see more of this. It's great at answering or helping people with problems that we've seen before. But when you're scaling up for the first time, you may be dealing with a lot of issues that you haven't seen before, and that's going to be pretty difficult for anyone other than a human on the other end to figure out. But as a first line, they're great, and
Yeah.
as you say, over time, there's definite improvements we've made there.
Yeah, to be honest with you, I'm more taking it from the approach of something that's well established and then can start being scaled down. And it's more finding a solution for the issues that people are having at the moment. But yeah, absolutely. If you're going to start with any product or any project, when you first create it, you're going to need to have that level of support to back it up. And when you start scaling up, that's when you are going to be needing that human interaction more than ever. So absolutely, I think that is really, really important at that point.
But again, it's pretty difficult to predict, isn't it? What that level of sport's going to be, what level of sport's going to be required. It's so difficult to know what percentage of your audience is going to be raising their hand and trying to get in touch. So yeah, it's difficult to think about ahead of time, I think. But again, being reactive and potentially a smaller rollout to begin with will really start to help your approach there. I mean, the other thing as well, talking about support, is the IT support behind this. Yeah, inevitably, as you increase your audience, there's a more chance of risk of something going wrong, and people needing to jump on pretty quickly. And again, when things do go wrong, the bigger that your audience is, the more pressure you're going to be under to quickly turn something around. So just making sure that you've got the right people that are able to quickly, if for want of a better word, put out a fire. It does get to that point occasionally where you just need to resolve some production issues. So yeah, having the right team in place to do that is an important thing as well.
Absolutely. If we talk about project management, Scott, with scaling that within a business, for instance, I mean, obviously we have so many different project management types at the moment and methods that we can use, but how do you see it affecting a business when you have to start scaling one project management type over another, if you will?
I think you can run Agile pretty well in smaller teams, and I think we see a lot of that. Certainly, when there's big, well-established product teams in place or project management teams in place, you can quite effectively bring in a new team to run Agile by themselves. The problem becomes, I think, when you've got multiple teams who are running in Agile and finding a way to easily kind of quickly see where every team is. The thing with waterfall projects and running lots of them simultaneously is that you can quite effectively get a snapshot of where everything is, because ultimately everything's got a plan and you're just X amount through the plan, and getting a quick snapshot of where that is at any point can be quite easily done at a high level. The difficult thing with Agile is it's very difficult to know where you are in the project, because it's always a bit of a moving target. You've all got a goal in mind for a product. You're always getting feedback. You're always adjusting backlogs. You're trying to manage teams and make sure that teams are well established, and teams may flex up and down depending on what's needed. There are various methodologies around to kind of strap onto the top of Agile. We've run them pretty effectively in companies in the past. But it does require a huge kind of shift of thinking for the whole organization. I think when you get to that point where you've got a couple of projects or a couple of teams that are running agile effectively, and you start to spread it throughout the business, it's definitely worth thinking about how you're going to manage it from kind of the top down, or at least be able to effectively report upwards and make sure that everyone knows what's going on at all times. And as I say, there are methodologies out there, but they're not trivial. They do require quite an overhead in terms of transforming, but when they're in place, it's great. And you can very effectively kind of change teams up depending on workload and make sure that everyone's changing their backlogs aligned to common goals. And yeah, it's really impressive to see, I think.
Awesome.
How about you? I mean, what have you seen in that area?
Personally, I think Agile can work. I'm actually a bigger fan of using waterfall, because, like you've said, I think it does show that snapshot, and I think you know exactly what's coming where, and I think that then it's easy to understand how to scale a project at the time. When you're using Agile, and when you see Agile taking over business, like you said, there's never really that. Everything seems a bit small scale, but it's everything. There's small parts to play into a bigger picture, and you have to then understand, I mean, how does this project look, and how does it scale compared to what it would do if you're using it as a waterfall project management style. So I think that for me, I actually prefer waterfall purely because, and seeing it within a business, I think it's more effective in terms of scaling. Let's talk about a digital product, for instance, that you're creating. I think it's more effective to understand how to scale it, how to understand where you are in terms of, like, if we go back to what we talk about in terms of our audience, so we understand our audience, how to scale at that point, the UX, for instance. And I think that it all plays a part. So for me, it's easier to actually measure the current project and understand the kind of scale that it's on, rather than Agile, which is kind of just a bit all over the place and you're not quite sure what's going on.
I think a lot of the time that's probably down to bad agile practice. And the problem with agile is it's often brought in because it's in quote marks so simple. It's a much simpler way to run things, but like that measurement piece is the real piece that gets missed, I think. And you're right. I think learning the thing with agile, I think, is actually great for a smaller rollout. If you're going to start small and slowly ramp up, I think it's fantastic for that, because what you can do at every stage of scaling up is actually get some feedback, and you've got scope to change things and even pull features out and test things as you go. But you do need a way of testing, and I think even with as long as agile has been in place in so many companies, a lot still miss that feedback step, which is crazy, but that's where we are. And you're right, in that case it really is difficult, because you're almost blind to what's being developed. You may as well, as you said, go back in that point to running essentially a predefined plan, which is actually what a lot of companies do anyway, except that waterfall will give you a lot more structure if you're going to run it that way anyway, and be honest from the start.
And that's what I mean. I just don't think that companies understand the scale of their project when they're using Agile. And I think it's because it's misused, personally, more than anything else. It is a misused methodology. It's misunderstood as well. And a lot of companies take their own approach to Agile. And I think that's where the issues come from. And then everybody starts calling themselves a Scrum Master. And they've had a 2-day training course on what Kanban is. And it's not the same. And it's not what proper Agile is. And I think that this is the issue that you have. And then effectively you don't know what your products, you don't know how to scale your product, because you don't know quite where you are as a team internally. So you don't quite know what you're actually producing at the time, and it makes the whole thing quite problematic.
Yeah, totally. I totally agree. And I think this is where actually, Scrum Masters and everyone else, I think, actually do play a very good part in bringing some of that change about. But again, it takes the whole organization to do really well, and certainly to scale it from just one team to multiple teams and then get the product delivery right across them is a complicated task. And it's not an easy feat by any means, but certainly can be done. And but it requires buy-in from everyone, not just a single team delivering something, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, cool. That's been a really interesting chat, Ollie. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how many companies do start scaling up this year. I think there's going to be a ton of it myself. And hopefully some of these tips will help people. I think, more than anything, it's worth just considering all of the aspects before you go into something like this. And there certainly are. It's not just the technical consideration, but it's everything else as well. And getting that right can really set you up for success here, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for listening. And if you like the podcast, please leave a review on iTunes. That really helps us. And of course, tell a friend. We'd love that as well. And most importantly, meet us for the next one in a couple of weeks' time. And have a great week. Thanks so much.
Cheers, guys.